What's up creators, Anthony here, and in this module we're going to cover everything you need to know about cameras to make educated purchases and get the most out of your money. Personally, I've spent well over $50,000 on gear associated with my filmmaking business, and along with that money I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours researching. My goal with this video is to share the primary aspects you need to consider to save you tons of money and tons of time, so you can just get straight to the fun part, which is actually creating content. So with that being said, let's talk about the most important piece of gear that you'll ever own, your camera. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to outline the primary features you should look at when purchasing a camera body, which will help you understand what features are most important to you. The first feature I look at in a camera is resolution. Now, resolution is the measurement of the total number of pixels in a single video frame. We'll talk more about resolution down the road, but it directly correlates to overall image quality. The standard that you want to look for is 1080p. This is considered full HD footage and tells you that a single video frame will consist of 1920 pixels horizontally and 1080 pixels vertically, hence the name 1080p. Now 1080p is the average resolution most televisions nowadays are capable of playing. Now, you may have noticed lately more televisions are advertising that they are 4K televisions. 4K is a resolution that is 4 times the pixel density of 1080p. A lot of cameras today can actually shoot 4K footage, and the highest end cameras, like those that are used on Hollywood productions, can actually shoot upwards of 8K footage. Now, increased resolution is great, but by no means is it necessary for commercial productions. Since most television screens and computer screens can't even play 4K footage, the difference can go practically unnoticed. Despite the fact that a lot of cameras I own can shoot in 4K, I typically downscale all of my products to 1080p when I export and deliver to my clients because the files are much smaller and they're easier to transfer. Recently, I actually produced a commercial for a client that is currently airing on cable television, and Xfinity, the business distributing the commercial, actually requested it be in 1080p rather than 4K. So at the end of the day, don't worry too much if your camera can't shoot in 4K. So long as you can do 1080p, you will be fine. Now, you might be thinking, well, my iPhone can shoot in 4K, so it must not be that much more money to get a 4K camera. Well, not all resolutions are created equal, and that brings me to the next feature of cameras you need to be aware of, which is sensor size. So all cameras operate by having a sensor which actually captures the light and turns it into an image we can view. The larger your sensor is generally means the better your image quality is. A full frame camera sensor like those in my 1DX Mark II and my Canon EOS R, which is what I'm using right now, shoot higher quality footage than my Nikon D3300, which has an APS-C sensor, which is 1.6 times smaller than a full frame sensor. Even if both cameras are shooting in 1080p resolution, the 1080p from the full frame sensor will look much better. This is because larger sensors perform better in low light. They produce more shallow depth of field and that background blur that looks really nice. And finally, the overall image is less compressed. Smaller sensors produce more compressed images because they have to fit the same number of pixels onto a much smaller size sensor. This is why the 4K footage from your cell phone isn't as good as the 4K footage from a Canon 1DX Mark II. Smaller sensors are also known as crop sensors simply because they crop in on an image when you're shooting. So for instance, say you take a picture on a full frame camera. When you take that same exact picture with the same lens on a crop sensor camera, that image will be zoomed or cropped in by a factor of however many times smaller that sensor is. So with an APS-C sensor that is 1.6 times smaller than a full frame sensor, the image will be cropped in by a factor of, you guessed it, 1.6 times. So hopefully you can see that larger sensors are better, but as with most things in life, they cost significantly more. The good news though, as technology is advancing every day, cameras with smaller sensors are capable of producing much better images than they used to be able to. To outline the common sensor sizes, you have full frame, APS-C, micro four thirds like those found on the Panasonic GH5, and then even smaller sensors like those found in cell phones, drones, GoPros, and so on. Don't be afraid to buy cameras with smaller sensors so long as their image quality still looks good. Personally, my second camera, the one I purchased after the $500 Nikon, was the Panasonic GH4, a micro four thirds sensor, and it was a beast of a camera. I loved it. The next feature, which you always have to consider and is directly related to resolution, is the frame rate of a camera, which is a measurement of how many individual video frames a camera is capable of capturing over the span of a single second. This spec is basically always right next to resolution when you're looking at cameras online. Frame rate is important because it determines your ability to use slow motion in your films. The higher your frame rate, the more you can slow the footage down before you start being able to see the quick pauses between the individual frames of video. 24 frames per second is the industry standard for regular speed footage. It's the point at which your eyes can't pick up on the gaps between frames and it looks like perfect continuous motion. 30 frames per second is another common low frame rate that most cameras have. But 24 frames per second is much more important. I hardly ever use 30 frames per second and you probably won't either. The next major bump that is important is 60 frames per second. Now 60 divided by 24 is 2.5, which means you can slow down footage at 60 frames per second by a factor of 2.5, giving you perfectly smooth slow motion. 60 frames per second at 1080p is what I would suggest you use as a baseline for any camera you're looking to purchase. You'll notice the relationship between frame rate and resolution is like a seesaw. As one goes up, the other goes down. So for example, if a camera is capable of shooting 60 frames per second at 1080p, it's probably capable of shooting 4K, but only at 24 or 30 frames per second. This is because both resolution and frame rate require a lot of processing power. So as one goes up, another has to go down for the increase in power required. Cameras like the 1DX Mark II are actually capable of shooting 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, which is why it's so expensive. It can also shoot 1080p footage at 120 frames per second, which is some serious slow motion. Again though, these features are absolutely not necessary for 95% of commercial productions. So stick to starting with a camera that can hopefully do 1080p at 60 frames per second. Now, these are the three primary characteristics I look at when purchasing a camera: resolution, frame rate, and sensor size. Next up, I have three secondary characteristics that are also extremely important, but they won't take as long to explain. These secondary characteristics are autofocus, color science, and low light. Up first, we have autofocus. Now, great autofocus is extremely nice and really helps speed up the learning curve of filmmaking. I primarily own Canon cameras because of their amazing dual pixel autofocus technology. Right now, for instance, my EOS R is filming in face tracking mode. So when I move up and back, you can see that the camera intelligently tracks my face. Wherever I go, it will maintain focus on my face, which saves me a ton of time and is super convenient. I honestly would struggle not having such great autofocus. Some filmmakers, however, place much less value on autofocus. For instance, there are a number of cinema cameras that cost tens of thousands of dollars that lack autofocus entirely. It all depends on your style of filmmaking and where you place value. Next up, we have color science. This is a camera's ability to accurately reproduce colors that match as close as possible to the real life colors. This is a really hard feature to quantify in cameras. Like, how do you put a number on it? You really can't, and a lot of it comes down to what you personally like. One thing I can tell you though is just about everyone in the industry agrees on the fact that Canon cameras produce amazing colors that look beautiful straight out of camera. Again, this is another reason I love Canon and primarily own only Canon products. I will say, however, that as technology is advancing, more and more brands are improving their color science. For instance, Sony recently has made great strides in improving their color science. Then finally, we have low light. This is a camera's ability to film in situations with low lighting and still produce nice images that contain little film grain or noise, which is a byproduct of trying to accommodate for low light. Larger camera sensors have more surface area to capture light, which is why they're generally much better at filming in low light. For example, a full frame sensor is 1.6 times the size of an APS-C sensor, which means it captures 1.6 times more light than the smaller sensor. That being said, low light performance varies camera to camera depending on the manufacturer's technology. For instance, Canon has good low light capacity across the board, but Sony has amazing low light capabilities and is realistically in a league of their own in that regard. The nice thing about commercial filmmaking though is you usually have a good amount of control in the lighting and can make up for a camera's inability to film in low light by introducing more light like I'm doing right now. And that does it for my primary and secondary characteristics to consider when purchasing camera gear. Other small things just to keep in mind at the end of the day though. Camera age. Basically, if a camera has been out for several years, there might be a newer version coming out in just a few months. You wouldn't want to buy a camera and then just immediately have a newer version come out. Ergonomics and ease of use. This is basically like, how are the buttons mapped out? What's the shape and form factor of the camera? Is it huge and heavy or small and light? And also, how are the menus laid out? Are they easy to navigate? Then finally, I always consider the overall manufacturer family that you're buying into. For instance, when you buy a Canon camera, you're buying into that family. You now have to primarily use Canon lenses and other Canon products. Versus if you buy Sony, now you have Sony's lenses and other Sony products and whatnot. So as you can see, when you buy into a brand, you kind of have to stick with their products. So make sure that you like their products. Canon and Sony are known for having really good lenses. Other brands like Panasonic don't have as many lenses, but they're building up on them any day. So just keep in mind what the overall manufacturer family is like. And that does it for this training on taking an educated approach to purchasing a camera. Armed with the information you've learned in this training alone, you have a much better understanding of how to spend your money in the best fashion possible. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.